Hey everybody, I'm Nicholas from LTA. I am pleased to be joined by Clayton Shaw of Spatial Audio, and we're going to dive right into this interview. Hey Clayton.
How's it going, Nicholas? Good to see you again.
Yeah, likewise, likewise. We'll start with the basics, I guess. Who are you? What's Spatial, and what the heck are open baffle speakers?
Right. Yeah. Well, Clayton Shaw is my name. I've been in the industry a long time, since the early to mid 70s. And I was in a variety of different roles, from, speaker manufacturing, retailing, pretty much everything, distribution, so forth. And it's one of those things, like, I'm sure you feel the same way. You get the bug, you can't get it out of your system. The very first time I ran into a true high-end system, it was a Macintosh vacuum tube separate system with a pair of large scale that I don't know if you guys have ever seen this, but it's a 3-screen magnaplaner that's gigantic, about 6 feet tall, about 5 or 6 feet wide. And I heard that when I was, a teenager, and that completely blew my mind. And so, I think that's where the interest level kind of locked in. It's like, okay, this is what I want to do. I don't know in what capacity, but, I was just totally into it. So, so the speaker interest started even earlier than that, as far as playing around. I wasn't aware of high-end audio, let's say it that way, but I was building speakers when I was like 13, something like that. There was back in those days, a Radio Shack was actually a pretty cool place. It was called Allied Radio Shack, and it was a big parts kind of store. So they not only had electronic parts, but they had kits like Dynaco kits, Heath kit, things like that you could build. And they had speaker drivers, crossover networks, all kinds of things. So you could walk in there as a consumer and kind of dig into the middle of this right away and start building your own gear. And in those days, a lot of people did build their own product, or their own audio gear. So that was like right in the early to mid 70s. That's kind of what I just stumbled into. So right in this city I lived in, grew up in, there was this Allied Radio Shack. So I would buy, every time I had enough money to buy a new driver, new woofer, whatever, I would buy what I could buy, build, experiment. And what I was really after was, at that time anyway, the sound of the Altec Voice of the Theater, which was a movie theater speaker that was repackaged, for consumer use, and extremely dynamic, really fast. Had some issues, but it was a really exciting, real high realism type product. And I was trying to copy that, basically, to see if I could do that type of build it kind of speaker. And one weird thing that happened is, when I was actually trying to build this A7, I didn't have the wherewithal to properly mount a back panel onto the box. This is pretty big,
Oh yeah, I remember
and
my dad building a speaker that we had in our home, and I mean the thing was easily 3 feet wide and
mm,
maybe 5 feet tall. Yeah.
yeah, this was a little smaller than that, but you're right. In those days, before acoustic suspension came out in from AR, speakers were large. That's the only way you could get bass performance. So anyway, so I ran this thing for a long time with no back on it. Had no idea I was listening to an open baffle speaker,
Right.
but it
How
did
old were you
sound
then? You said
actually.
like 13?
Yeah, that was, by the time that was done, it was a little later, but 14,
Right.
15, whatever.
Right.
And so I was listening to this open baffle speaker the whole time, had no idea what the benefits were, but at that point. But anyway, fast forward, I just happened to know a guy that was a good speaker designer in the 80s that demonstrated a open baffle subwoofer that he had built with 3 15-inch woofers. And as soon as I heard that, as far as bass reproduction, I was like, this is the way to do it. It's so clean and fast, where the decay just decays right off. There's no ringing and boxiness and all that. Because up to that time, I was building and designing box speakers. So I had already been doing that for a long time, right? And then, so I still designed and built box speakers after that point, which is around, 1987 or something. But I started doing a lot of testing and research on this open baffle thing. And you got to realize back in those days it was difficult because there really wasn't, you couldn't model anything back in that time, but very few people knew anything about it. Not that it's rocket science, but you can't just take an off-the-shelf woofer and get good performance. You really have to design a purpose-developed woofer for this to do it right. Otherwise, but we'll get into that in a second. But if you want to have bass, you have to have a dipole designed woofer. So anyway, so we did a lot of work on that. And a lot of that was experimentation, again, because there really wasn't much to go by in terms of textbooks and prior art, let's call it. So in any event, and I just kept with it. I think that's a lot of my success story, is that I just never gave up. And when you're in the middle of that, you don't think that way. You don't think, if I just keep doing this forever, I'll finally get good at it. But that's in a sense what happened. So about 20 years of that, I think we learned a lot about it. And then coincident with that was, as time went by, like in the 90s, you start seeing people come along like Siegfried Lindquist, who was already a well-known designer, and he had come to the conclusion that open baffle was a superior approach, and laid out a lot of mathematics and background about why that is and how they actually operate. So that's helpful. Also, that gave us some more grounded information to follow. So by the 90s, a lot of people were actually working with this, I think, and but it was, as you well know, it was really a DIY kind of thing for a long time, because nobody commercially was making one. There was a couple of things here and there that were odd, but never had any, traction in the commercial market.
Well, that strikes me that it might have lent itself to some, really great experimentation, in that, the DIY community, they're not really worried about commercialization so much, right?
Exactly.
They're just searching for the best techniques, and they've got the freedom to try new stuff without having to worry about, supply chains and production and things like that. And then, just let your imagination go wild, and then, worry about, all right, let's see how we can make the best version of this, commercially viable.
Yeah, that's a great point. There is a lot more freedom to explore. That whole issue, and you guys know this, I'm sure, because that Zodal circuit's difficult to build, and you have to build it. You can't just put it on a chip or outsource it. So this commercialization thing and being practical to manufacture is a real big issue, and speakers in some ways in particular, because they're large and expensive, and it takes capital equipment and a facility to make speakers. You can't make them in your garage in any kind of quantity anyway, right? So yeah, and you're right. At that point, I didn't care about whether it was practical or not. So in fact, I took an engineering prototype to the Rocky Mountain Show in 2006 or something, just as, it wasn't for sale. It was saying, hey, this is what I've been working on, and it's pretty cool. And that was the reaction, was, that's amazing. Can you, take this giant, because it was pretty big, can you take this thing and put it in a commercial format to where, it's a product and people could buy it and it's reasonably priced. And I did do that. It was called the Emerald Physics CS2, came out in 2007, I think. But that was very difficult. It looks so simple that you think, well, that's so easy, but that commercialization step is difficult, I think, for everyone. So, I mean, long story short, so Emerald Physics became pretty popular, and I could probably say, besides Danny Ritchie doing a great job promoting the idea on the DIY side, that CS2 speaker was really kind of the first, production product that you just go out and buy, and people had heard of, and was starting to get some traction. The drawback to it was that it required a DSP controller, signal processor, to function, to work, for equalization and electronic crossover and so forth. So, but it totally worked. It sounded great. It wasn't that big of a hassle, but it was somewhat of a hassle. So when I started Spatial, which was actually a room correction software company initially, most people may not know that. when we started getting back into speakers, that was really my main goal, was to make a plug and play product that did not require any kind of signal processor, external boxes, right? So that was about 2015 when we introduced the M3 and the M1 and those models, and that really worked, and that really took off because it was practical for consumers to just buy it and plug it in, use a regular amplifier. You don't need to buy amplify and that kind of thing. So anyway, that's the quick background.
Sure, sure. Yeah. Well, and before we get into some pros and cons, I had a thought when you were talking that, so like you said, the Zodal circuit that we make, it's unique and it's hard to build. And so I'm thinking, and so are your speakers, right? So what made it that you gravitated towards this different, probably harder, road than just making traditional box speakers? And it strikes me, when you're talking about that first, system, we all have that first system that we heard that, turned us onto this, and it included Magnepans, right? Which are not your usual speaker. Anyone that walks into a room with Maggies knows that they're looking at something different. And I'm thinking like that might have, was that a part of your inspiration? And I guess, further on from that, why do you choose to make these, weird speakers that don't have a box?
Yeah, good question. Yeah, I think that it's fair to say, for me, and I think a lot of other guys, that the Magneplanar was a very important product technology, because I guess if nothing else, it gave you some impression of the scale and of the sound stage, like there's an event, okay, and that there was an immersion that you weren't getting from box speakers, to where this weird sense where the music just appears in the room instead of like it's coming out at you. It's sort of like it's there already and you're just, inside that event, or you're observing it. But the fact it's a different feeling. And so it's hard to go back to a box speaker after that, because you get more of a directed, thing. And so I think for me that's true. I think I wanted to get that sound. I wanted to get that big open sort of, particularly on classical music, where you can get that full orchestral sort of scaling. But I wanted to get, there were things about it I didn't like, particularly the earlier Magnepans before they came out with the ribbon, which was a great improvement. But, it was, it's not very dynamic, slow efficiency, limited bass. Scaling of the individual instruments is a problem with any kind of large panel. If you, an individual instrument like an acoustic guitar can tend to be out of scale and too large sounding. So, and a lot of people mention that. I've heard plenty of customers tell me that. And it's amazing how many of our customers have owned Magnepans in the past. So it is an important product technology. And so that's really what I'm after, is to create something that is a hybrid, the best of both worlds. If you could take a product that's really accurate, like a studio monitor from Genelec, for example, that is very, very accurate from a technical standpoint, and it's very dynamic. It's, it's very efficient. You see that in the Pro speakers a lot. It's very high efficiency, large drivers, Klipsch, JBL, some of these large studio monitors, things like that. But add refinement, imaging, and have that scaling 3D effect. So that really kind of is a blending of all of these different things. That, I think, for me, that's really what I've been working on, is sort of this comprehensive solution. And I think the market is saying that we've achieved that. So, I feel good about it, but it took forever to figure it out.
Right.
And make it a product, right? So.
Sure. Well, and I mean, I get asked about your speakers all the time, and, so the question that I get a lot, and frankly, I can't answer, so I'm going to ask it to you. How do they work? How do, people call me up baffled about how open baffle speakers work, and they say,
Sure.
they just don't really believe it. Almost, they're like, I just, I'm sitting there with them, and I can tell them that, look, I hear them every day, and they sound fantastic. But how do you get the sound, that full bass, that airiness? Why does it work? How does it work? Without getting too technical.
Sure. Well, if you look at the different types of speakers, enclosed box, open box, these kind of things, it really is the simplest form that you could make a speaker. If you took a panel and you put a woofer on it, that's what makes it open baffle is, it's really, the proper term is dipolar, to where if you put a woofer onto this panel, there's a positive pressure wave coming off the front of it when it's in positive phase. So you get this effect where you're pressurizing air in the front of it, and there's also at the same time a negative pressure field behind it. So the back side of it is out of phase with the front side. That can be good and bad. There's some, like in everything else in physics, there's always trade-offs, and that's really kind of maybe the key word in this whole discussion about boxes versus open baffle. It's really managing the trade-offs. And if you can minimize or eliminate the negatives, then you have all positives left. And that's really kind of what I think I've done here. So what's really happening is super simple. And that is that there's an interference effect on the edges of the panel, on the sides and top and bottom, to where the front and the back wave meet, and they're out of phase with each other. So they just cancel out. They're just nothing. But that is only in the lower frequency part of the range. It has to be, that's related to the baffle size and the woofer size, so wavelengths. So short wavelengths are not involved in that, but long, if you're talking about 10, 20, 30-foot wavelengths, they just simply wrap around the cabinet. So they meet together, they cancel out. And that's actually why designers don't like that. They say, well, we need to eliminate that problem. We'll put a box on the back of it, and we're going to isolate the front and the back so they don't cancel. And you get a lot more bass that way. So it's more efficient, but it doesn't, therein lies the rub. It's like, yeah, but what about the way it sounds and the way it loads the room? That's really the problem. So in other words, it would be great to eliminate the box if you could get bass out of it and make it work. And so that's really that's my job. But the most commonly thought of attribute of getting rid of the box is the fact that you don't hear the box sound. And that involves a number of things like cabinet vibration, cavity effects, all kinds of different things are going on with because the box is a resonant system, right? So you say, well, that'd be great to get rid of all that, but that's actually not the biggest problem. It is a noticeable audible problem, but the biggest problem is the way it operates in a room. And this is really the overarching key to all this, is that boxes don't ideally work very well, or maybe even shouldn't be used in rooms that are the kind of size we see in houses. Okay, they're really too small. The boundaries are too close to the speaker. So in an auditorium, this is why pro audio works well with boxes and movie theater speaker design, which is where audio came from. When silent movies went to soundtrack movies, that is audio. That's what we took it from. And we were even buying movie-derived, movie theater speakers, right? So if in an auditorium, let's just say, it's a huge room, the box problems aren't, the way it loads the room is not a problem because the boundaries are a long distance away from it. But you take that same speaker and you put it in a living room that's 12 feet wide, 15 feet long, and immediately what happens is it creates a real problem because the bass is radiating omnidirectionally. So there's energy coming out the sides and the top and bottom, as well as the lengthwise of the room, right? So the problem is, in a home, those perpendicular, height and width, those are the ones that are close to the speaker. So you're just dumping energy into resonant storage, room modes in the room. And that's what makes it sound muddy. And the closer you get to the boundary, the worse it gets. This is why you don't put speakers in the corner, right? Okay, so imagine then going back to the open baffle design where, okay, what we have now is more of since there's cancellation on around the periphery of it, we have what's left over as far as bass, which is like figure eight effect. So there's a lobe coming out of the front, there's one coming out of the back, and there's nothing coming out of the sides or top. Okay, well that's perfect because we now don't have energy going out into these boundary resonance systems. What we're left with is just the direct sound. This is a generalization. It's not quite that tidy, but but that's really what's happening is we've created a directional bass system, and there really isn't any other practical way to do that and eliminate all this room interaction stuff. So the smaller the room gets, the more this is an issue, and it comes up quite often. It's like, well, if my room is this small, like I took over my kid's bedroom when they moved out, went to college, the room is 10 by 12. Isn't that too small to put a open baffle speaker in? Because they're thinking, they've always heard, hey, magneplaners need large rooms, and it is very helpful to have a big open space. But as far as this room interaction problem goes, it's actually even more beneficial if the room is 10 or 12 feet, in 10 times 12, because the box speaker is going to have that much more problem working in a room that's that small. And this is exactly why, if you go back, I don't even remember, but I'm going to say the 70s, when the BBC in England, the whole idea there was don't even try to produce bass. That's where all the mini monitor stand mount thing came from, and it works. That's good advice, because if you're in a small room, which in Europe rooms are generally quite small, that's probably the thing to do, is just forget the deep bass altogether and focus on the rest of it, so you don't have all the problems and the droning, and because that boominess and droning and overlay kind of effect of the room sound in the bass, that affects the mid-range too. So that's one thing that I think that's really interesting when you switch to open baffle, that you go, is it just me or is the mid-range? There's a lot more information. It's like you just unmask the whole thing. So there's a lot of benefits to this approach, and some of it you wouldn't necessarily measure it or know how to measure it, but you can definitely hear it or perceive it. So that's why I don't think your question about what kind of room would be appropriate, really any kind of room, because of the advantages of the way it loads the room.
Sure.
So you know what I mean? So
well, I mean, that leads me to another question that frankly I get when I start talking about your speakers with people is, what are the considerations, right? So that frankly that surprised me, that if you have a small room, these speakers are actually might be give you a little bit more freedom than with a box speaker, and I guess what you're saying is that it's because you're taking the room out of it a little bit, right?
yeah, in the bass range, yeah,
right.
And that's where the problem is.
So, but here's another question that I have for you. What I've heard is that the open baffle speakers prefer to be away from walls, right? And I guess you can tell me, but more. You want ideally a couple feet from the back wall. Is the back wall the most important in that respect? But my real question is, what considerations do I have to, if I have a small room, how does that match up with it being away from the walls and that whole thing? So I guess in a more general level, I'm a customer, I've got the typical living room type of room. What considerations do I need to keep in mind with the speakers, and what do you recommend?
Yeah, it's great. And that question comes up all the time in emails and calls. They say, well, I've heard they have to be way away from the wall, and of course, that's relative. I mean, way away 2 or 3 feet is not that bad. It depends on your room decor and so forth, but your furniture layout. But the secret is that box speakers, they're the ones, they have to be out away from the wall also, just for different reasons. Again, because of the way they have energy in the bass coming out omnidirectionally, if you put them up against the wall, whether it's the side wall or the front wall in front of you, you're going to have problems. And if you look at most good setups, in the media where you see a guy that has a really good pair of box speakers like a Wilson or something like that. They're way away from the wall. There's nobody, that doesn't work to put them against the wall, not only for room loading reasons, but also that sense of depth, perspective is in many ways essentially the same as however far they are away from the wall. So if you pull them out 5 feet, you tend to have a guaranteed 5-foot deep soundstage. You can get the perception that goes through the wall, but so it doesn't matter if you're going to have an audiophile installation, it's going to probably be 2 or 3 feet away from the wall, regardless. It's just that's for different reasons. In the case of the open baffle speaker, it has to do with this cancellation again. We're trying to come out far enough to where we're dealing with the timing of the counter wave behind the speaker in order to produce proper bass level. But the end result's the same. You still have to pull either type out away from the wall. So that's really not an issue. So if a guy's going into it thinking, oh, I'll buy a little box speaker so that I can put them against the wall, that's fine, but that's not an audiophile installation. You're not going to get that realism and depth and soundstage and so forth, generally speaking. So so that's kind of a non-issue, in other words, as far as I'm concerned.
Are there any other misconceptions or myths that you hear a lot, that you're talking to customers every day and they're asking these same questions, and you always have to sort of dispel these myths about open baffle speakers? Are there any other things that people commonly think that is just not true, or maybe you need a little bit more nuance?
Well, yeah, sure. I think so. The room placement is one at the size of room required, but the other one you hear all the time, which is a normal question, is, well, if you can't really normally get bass out of an open baffle speaker, how do you do it? In other words, why, isn't that really the question? If you're doing it, then great. And if so, why isn't everyone else, and so forth? So that comes back down to this question about how you design an open baffle speaker. It's not that easy. Once you learn how to do it, it's not that hard. But the key to it is that, again, let's say that you and I are going to design a speaker for LTA. You're going to come out with your own speaker. It's a box speaker, stand mount 2-way. And what we would do, we would get in these catalogs and look at drivers that are available, that are high quality, like a ScanSpeak or whatever. And those drivers, and there's many of them, catalogs full of them, the parameters that they operate under, the suspension design and all that, are designed for either sealed box or vented bass reflex boxes. And so that's where a lot of the mythology comes from, and the mistakes when guys are experimenting. If you buy a woofer like that and you put it in an open baffle design, you won't really get any bass to speak of. So that's a given. If you get into this area, is you have to either design your own woofer or find one that's designed for dipole operation. Because it's not only a matter of getting the bass level high enough, but it's also has to do with the ability to control its motion. Because in this case, there's no pressure box, behind it to sort of damp and control the motion. It's on its own, so it has a lot of work to do. It has to self-center properly and so forth. So they tend to have a stiffer suspension. It's a different kind of woofer setup. It'll look the same on the outside, but the parameters are different. So, and that's one of the things we did in the Spatial product line. We started designing our own drivers so that we could optimize the performance, and then we've improved that over time. So if you look at the M3, I think when you first came to LTA, you had a pair of the M3 triodes, I believe.
That's right.
And that was a pretty cool speaker. But we came so far in woofer development that the new single woofer M5 has better bass and more bass than the twin 15-inch woofer model that you saw there. And you've had the new M3 Sapphire at the shop, and you can probably attest to the bass is mind-boggling. It's not just, oh, it's good, it's good, it's open baffle. It's like better than most box speakers in terms of output and so forth. So I think so that gets back to this thing about you just keep at it. You just keep working on testing and engineering and you just move forward. But that's the biggest myth, is open baffle speakers don't have bass. Well, listen to these and you'll, and same thing, there's a brand called Pure Audio Project from Israel. They figured it out also. Great sounding speaker. You listen to it and you go, that's got amazing bass. And so it's really a matter of design and engineering to overcome these inherent sort of limitations of not having a box.
Well, and maybe that's it, right? Like you mentioned, Pure Audio Project, and then there's Spatial. Those are really the only two open baffle speaker companies that I can name off the top of my head. And so it strikes me that most people would, if they've heard open baffle speakers at all, they've probably they might have heard the most from a DIY in a DIY situation.
Yeah.
And who knows what the what that particular person is doing? Are they just buying these off the shelf drivers? Probably. And then are they buying the right one? And so once they get into something that's been fully designed like yours or the Pure Audio Project ones, then then you start to see what the true potential is.
Yeah, that's actually a good point I hadn't thought of, is that if a lot of the experiences people have had around open baffle were in the DIY world, like your buddy built a pair of open baffle speakers, you might have a negative viewpoint of them because they're not commercially developed and supposedly highly engineered. So but yeah, I mean, I think if you lined up 10 or 20 people and they listened to a Pure Audio Project or a Spatial speaker, every single person would say, I can't believe you're getting that kind of bass out of it. So it's not it's not a contestable thing at this point. It's no longer a point where you go, you would argue about anymore. So.
Yeah, there was actually a recent conversation I had with a customer who was, a DIY person who was, had been on the journey of building his own open baffle speakers for a while, had apparently come to maybe Florida or Capital Audio Fest and heard yours. And he was saying, I'm not sure I'm going to continue to build these speakers anymore because, I think he was searching for that solution to the problems that he had heard in other DIY speakers. And then he heard yours and he's like, well, that does everything I needed to do. So why am I going to build my own?
Yeah. Well, we encourage people to build their own anything, amps, speakers, everything, because it's fun and you learn that way and so forth. But at the stage that at least we're at, I don't know about Pure Audio Projects internally, but Spatial is we've now brought everything in-house. So we have our own machinery. We produce all the parts except for the drivers. So part of the idea of that is efficiencies and economies of scale. So if we make a lot of speakers, we can keep the price pretty low, like it is now, particularly selling factory direct. And it makes it kind of crazy to say, yeah, I'm just going to do this myself. You can, but you're very unlikely that you could match the performance. Now, if you buy a kit that's engineered like the GR Research, then that would work. But doing it on your own is kind of very, very difficult, although I still encourage people to do it as a learning process. So.
Sure. Well, on that, do you have any, because there are a lot of DIYers out there, certainly in the DC community. That's where Capital Audio Fest started, a ton of DIY people. And then I think for some reason, open baffle speakers just appeal to DIYers. I'm not sure why, but do you have any, tips for people outside of, dipole driver? I think we already hit on, any other tips that, are maybe simple, relatively cheap that people can do to improve their DIY projects, until of course they decide to just buy a pair of Spatials.
Yeah, just buy our speakers.
Right.
That's the easiest thing to
try
do.
once, right?
I don't know. There'd probably be an endless number of little things I might recommend depending on the design that they're working with. But for the most part, what makes it difficult is that if you're a DIYer, what woofer are you going to buy? Because you're not designing your own. And there are solutions to that. There are a couple of companies that make ready-made dipole woofers, but you'd have to know what those are, how to use them. There's a lot more involved than it appears, just because it's so simple looking that you overlook a lot of potentially a lot of technical details, because it's like, how hard could this be? And then you find out, well, you can get pretty good sound, but it's like anything else. Box speakers are actually the same way. If you try to build your own, you can get pretty good results out of it, but you can't necessarily compete with someone that really knows what they're doing and already has economies of scale and so forth, and production capability, that know how to assemble a product. And it can end up costing you more to go down to a cabinet shop and get the box made, for example.
Sure. Well, another question that comes to mind is, so you mentioned early on that part of your inspiration to start Spatial was getting rid of the separate DSP situation.
Right.
But then you started Spatial as a software company, so there's something in there. But now, so you have your M line, and that is a completely passive speaker, and then you have your X line, which has it's no DSP, right? But it's a powered sub. So
Yeah.
why did you go with that? Talk to me about the differences in the M and the X, and why I would maybe choose one versus the other. What's going on?
Yeah, good question. It's actually the answer is simpler than you would think, and it's simply, if you look at all of our products, they're relatively small, okay, compared to a lot of what we've seen in open baffle speakers. If I want to keep this form factor of about no more than 48 inches tall, then in order to go from a two-way to a three-way to try to optimize mid-range performance, I don't have room for enough bass drivers. Okay, so in other words, if I took an M3 that has two 15-inch woofers, which is like the proper setup, and then made it a three-way, I can do that, no problem, but it starts getting pretty large. And so one way around that, and what I think is an excellent alternative, is to have the one specially designed woofer that is directly powered and controlled by it is DSP controlled, but just low frequency. So your normal amplifier is not involved in that. So, these issues about, I can hear DSP or whatever, doesn't come into play if it's just a subwoofer. So going to an active subwoofer allows me to have the output of the two passive 15s, and then keep the overall baffle size small. That's the reason for it.
Gotcha. That brings to mind another question about, so we talked a lot about how it sounds and choosing the right drivers and things like that. Your speakers look great, and they obviously look different than a DIY and certainly pure audio project. What's that process like? How do you design the speakers from a visual perspective, and what part, how does that interact or not with the sonic side?
Yeah, well, I think you may be the same way, but I'm kind of a modern furniture nut, and not just modern in that sense, but going all the way back to just Bauhaus type sensibilities in industrial design, where things are plainer, they're clean, they're not trendy to where they get, they look dated. That's just the way I have always been anyway. And so open baffle lends itself to that quite nicely, because it as you can look at our product and see that it just makes sense to make it a plainer looking product. But yeah, I think I don't know this, but I feel like we're in many ways more sensitive to the styling side of it and the industrial design side than a lot of other companies. A lot of companies, as you probably know, in our industry, they're very, very small. So there may be, in many cases, the owner of the company is an engineer, and he also does all of the design work. The engineering design in terms of the mechanical, electrical, but also the styling. And that's where you can run into a problem, because as you get into larger companies, they have people specifically to do that. They have industrial designers and people that understand color and materials and the way things look and all that. And you can't really do that you don't see that very often in small companies. So one option is you outsource it, like you guys did with Ferd and Roby. That's a perfect example. And that chassis looks amazing, right? and Christopher knows what he's doing. That's his profession. So you expect a high level of execution on, say, the design of that Z10 chassis. We've done the same thing for years. There's an industrial designer that lives in Salt Lake named David Evett, who's very good and has done a lot of really cool, advanced type of industrial design work. So we've been using him on an outsourced basis for a long time, and our whole process is pretty closely coupled with him, because if he's doing the CAD design for the chassis in order to do the styling, well, you're already working on the mechanics anyway at that point. I mean, it's all the same thing. So when you get that developed, that you're done, that is the chassis. So then you obviously test it and work with it after that with prototypes. But yeah, I'd say we outsource it. But over time, though, we have done more in-house. I do some of the styling stuff myself now. It's not my strong area, but I'm not that bad at it. I've at least, over more recent years, I've learned a lot, and it's something I enjoy. So I'd like to do some of our own styling ourselves in-house. But anyway, so we're very similar to you. So I think that's the smart thing to do. If you're a smaller company, find a really good design house. This is why Ferrari and Aston Martin, one of the reasons they became successful is they didn't try to style the car themselves. They went out and hired a professional car design house like Pininfarina and said, here, we'll pay you guys. You come up with an amazing car. If Ferrari looked like a 1970 Dodge Polaris or something, it wouldn't be a brand. See, so this is a big deal, getting the industrial design right. And Apple showed us more than anybody what that's about. If products look amazing and they're beautifully crafted, then that creates a desire to own them. And so if you just stick with the engineering side, and it may be the best sounding amp in the world, but if you look at it and you don't want to buy it, you don't want to own it, then what's the point of it? See, so we think the speakers need to look really good, but that is subjective, because it is, with speakers, it starts getting more into kind of the furniture realm, because it's a large object and it gets difficult. But one of the things that feedback we get quite commonly is that when they buy the speakers, they've never heard them or seen them, because we sell factory direct, but they've heard about them, right? So all they've really seen is the frontal image, which is fairly large. I mean, it's 18 inches wide, right? But when they get them, they realize, wow, this thinness factor is huge. And when the speaker's only a couple of inches deep, it just looks much smaller once you put it in the room, like magneplaners or something. Of course, they're tall, but the thin thing is really a huge advantage for us, I think.
Yeah, they take up somehow some less mental space in the room, because they don't have that big box. And yeah, I love the design. I mean, the interesting thing about the design of your speakers is that they fit in any decor, right? So I've seen them in extremely modern settings, homes, and then but they would fit in fine. And that's why I think partly I think they're great for condos and sort of the younger set. I'll include myself in that. And but then they would fit.
You're not that young.
No, I'm not. I got some gray. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Well, I mean, you're only 107 yourself.
I know.
So
yeah, I'm just joking.
you look pretty good. Too. But they also fit in a traditional design. They're sort of chameleons in that way. And I couldn't agree with you more about the aesthetics in general in audio. There's some people, I think, that are in a very small percentage of people in audio that are, I don't care what it looks like. It just just tell me what it sounds like. But what I bring up cars all the time when I'm talking to customers, and I say, you'd never heard of Porsche or Ferrari if they look like crap. It's not, we make our buying decisions, we put things in our home, not just for a single reason. And like you said, we are putting these in our homes, and they are furniture, and ideally they're furniture that we keep for years and years and years. And so it's got to tick more than one box. It can't just sound good.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think that's why having a simplicity is a real advantage in the look of the product. If it's adorned with a lot of stuff, it'll tend to be dated looking after a while. So if you can stick with clean lines and not put a lot of adornments on it, it's a real advantage. And the products themselves are actually quite modern. So it makes you look quite modern. So it's interesting. I agree with you. I've seen a lot of installations pictures that have been sent in where the room is not particularly modern and they still look good. So I think that clean lines thing is what it's about.
For sure. Well, Clayton, is there anything else that you want to talk about? Anything in the world or the industry? I mean, we're here in our homes because of the virus, but anything else going on at the company?
Well, let me mention one other thing because it relates to your product. One of the things that I worked in the professional pro audio industry for some time, like 7 years or something like that. And one of the things that I learned right off that I wasn't really expecting, but it brought me back to the original, like when I was a kid with the Altex and all that, is that high efficiency is really important in terms of sounding real. And that's not something you can't measure the sound of what sounds real, but you can, most people have heard a pair of like Klipschorns or something and think, wow, that's so dynamic and so alive. And that's really directly related to this efficiency question. So since that's been an important parameter, we've been doing that all along, even back in the early days. We've been using high efficiency drivers, pro drivers, that sort of thing. But one of the nice side benefits is the application side of it, that we can take a product like the Z10, which is a 12-watt amplifier, which is an amazing sounding amplifier, but it is only 12 watts. And so here's a speaker that you can use that kind of amplifier with. You can use anything you want, basically. So I think that's pretty cool too. And that freedom to choose the amp and get the sound you want. And many of the best sounding amps are small, low powered, like the Z10. So that's all I was going to say, is I think that's another benefit. That's one of the reasons that we have a relationship where we go to shows together, because your products drive our speaker real well. It's a good matchup.
Indeed. And, give us all the credit. The Z10 is 13 watts into the M3, the 12 versus
4
13.
ohms.
It's all of 13, not 12. All right, Clayton. Well, this has been fun. I appreciate it. And we'll talk soon, man.
Okay. Good to see you again. We'll talk soon.
Great.
Bye-bye.